In the fall of 1986, not long after Halloween, the atmosphere at the Fort Berthold Reservation began to feel oppressive. Not because of the weather, but due to the chilling rumors that spread rapidly throughout the community. It was a time when many locals began sensing that something was amiss. Everything started with what seemed like harmless news. A few hikers mysteriously disappeared near Lake Sakakawea, leaving no trace behind except for their camp, where everything remained intact as if they had never ventured far. But then, strange events gradually unfolded, transforming into a horrifying tale that haunted the entire region. North Dakota, a land of vast fields and lush green hills stretching to the horizon, is a place where time seems to slow down. Here, autumn usually arrives with crisp winds, bringing with it the golden hues of the leaves and the characteristic stillness of rural America. But in the fall of 1986, the Fort Berthold Reservation, it was no longer the peaceful autumn everyone was accustomed to. Fort Berthold is where I was born and raised, a Native American reservation deep in the heart of North Dakota. To outsiders, this may just be a remote land, but to me, it is everything. This is home, the roots, place where I was nurtured and taught, where ancient stories and legends still live on through the words of the elders. My name is Dakota Stone, a son of Fort Berthold, and currently a senior at a university in Bismarck, the largest city in North Dakota. The opportunity to attend college wasn't easy for someone from a reservation like me, but I was awarded a scholarship, a ticket to escape the endless cycle of rural life, to explore the world beyond, and carve out a new future for myself. But no matter how far I go, Fort Berthold is always in my heart. Every time I return, I feel the warmth of family, the small community. However, that fall, everything felt different. A sense of unease lingered in the air, like a dark cloud hovering overhead, waiting to unleash a storm. Everything began with the mysterious disappearances. On a chilly evening, right after Halloween, hikers mysteriously vanished while exploring trails around Lake Sakakawea. That lake, with its calm waters and stunning natural scenery, usually attracted many visitors. But now, it had become the source of terrifying rumors and chilling stories. They found their campsite, but not a trace of life remained. The campfire had gone out, the tents abandoned, and there was no sign of a struggle. It was as if they had been swallowed by the darkness, vanishing without leaving a single trace. Police search efforts yielded no results. The tense faces of loved ones, the worried eyes of the reservation's residents, all reflected an invisible fear, something beyond human comprehension. Just a week later, an old rancher was found dead near the edge of the reservation. His name was Tom, a man who had lived there his entire life, known for his resilience and tough demeanor. He had just had a pacemaker installed and was still as healthy as a young colt. But now, he lay there, lifeless and cold. His death was listed as a heart attack, but no one in the community believed it. What troubled people the most were the strange marks on his neck, unexplained scratches as if something had attacked him from the shadows. When I returned home for Thanksgiving, I truly felt the unease that had spread everywhere. Stories of strange creatures, unexplained phenomena began to spread like wildfire in the summer, whispered in grocery stores, cafes, and over phone conversation. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was all just imagination, but an odd feeling I couldn't shake began to creep into my mind. Even my parents, usually practical and strong, started to act more anxious, locking doors more carefully each night. Fort Berthold, the place where I grew up with stories of skinwalkers and shadow wolves, no longer felt like the peaceful place I once knew. The tales I'd heard as a child, stories I always thought were meant to scare kids, now seemed more real than ever. I'm not a superstitious person, but deep down I began to feel a sense of doubt, an urge to find out what was really happening. That Thanksgiving dinner was incredibly tense. I sat there, silently listening to everyone's conversations. My younger brother, Josh, kept asking our cousins about monsters and the creepy stories he had heard from his friends. They reassured him with half-joking answers, but I could sense that no one truly believed those reassurances. Kyle, my cousin, who was usually tough and somewhat arrogant, kept saying, "It's just a myth." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked its usual confidence. Inside, I had this strange, hard-to-explain feeling. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Back home, living in the city, away from the reservation, I had mostly forgotten the old stories about shadow wolves or skinwalkers that we used to tell each other on dark nights. But now, being back in my familiar home, I found myself listening more carefully than ever, as if some ancestral instinct within me was still alert to the sounds carried by the wind. When I got back home, I banged on the door, breathless as I recounted the story. My father and cousins quickly rushed to the truck, guns ready in hand. Josh peered out the window, his eyes wide with excitement, and a strange sense of pride flickered in his gaze. My mother looked like she was about to faint, but she had always hated stories of violence, even when that violence was necessary. When the men returned to the field, they found nothing but the torn carcass of the deer. There were large footprints, not human, but the hard ground made it impossible for them to track the creature very far. That night, our house became a fortified stronghold, and I couldn't get a wink of sleep. The next morning, as the family gathered around the breakfast table, I recounted every detail of the encounter from the night before. Everyone listened in silence, no one interrupting, only the soft clink of a spoon against a cup as my mother poured more coffee. Josh, my younger brother, looked at me with wide, gleaming eyes, as if my story had confirmed everything he had ever heard about monsters in the dark. I didn't want to encourage such thoughts, but I knew once he had heard it, there was no taking it back. My father sat across from me, his eyes contemplative, deep, as if trying to piece together what I had told him with the things he knew, the stories he had heard from the elders. Maybe it was just wolves, he said, his voice low, calm, but not hiding his doubt. I didn't respond, just looked at him. I knew it wasn't wolf. After breakfast, my father and I went outside to check the fence. The ground in the area where I had encountered the creature the night before still showed some signs, but they weren't clear enough for us to follow. The large footprints, unlike any animal we had ever seen, stretched toward the forest. The hard, dry ground made tracking nearly impossible. But one thing was certain. Something been there. We returned home, filled with an unspoken worry. That night, after the house was locked up and the lights turned off, I still couldn't sleep. My mind was haunted by the image of that creature. I decided to go outside, despite the protests in my head. I needed to make sure the creature hadn't come back. Though the fear still lingered in my chest, I couldn't sit still any longer. Grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, feeling the cold November night seeping through my thick coat. I walked along the fence, where I had seen the creature the previous night, then ventured further toward the woods. The wind blew hard, rustling the bare branches overhead. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Just when I began to think I was overreacting, a strange sound echoed from behind the trees. It wasn't the wind, nor the rustling of leaves. It was a low, growling sound, like the deep sigh of a predator stalking its prey. I instinctively stepped back, shining the flashlight toward the sound, and before I could grasp what was happening, those glowing amber eyes appeared once again in the darkness. It was standing there, only a few meters away from me, larger than I had ever imagined. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me, as if evaluating me once more. My heart pounded erratically. My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight tightly, but I didn't dare move. In that moment, I knew I couldn't outrun it this time. The creature was too fast, too powerful. All I could do was stand there, face to face with it. But instead of charging at me as I had feared, the creature turned away, silently disappearing into the depths of the forest, like a shadow in the night. I stood there for a long time, frozen in fear, before turning and sprinting back home as fast as I could. In the days that followed, the situation at the reservation worsened. People began whispering about new disappearances. A hunter was reported missing in the woods, and livestock continued to be found brutally torn apart. Strange wounds on the carcasses, inexplicable footprints, all seemed to point in the same direction. Something dangerous and mysterious was lurking up. My father and the men in the area started organizing armed night patrols. They didn't explicitly say what prompted them to do so, but everyone shared the same feeling. Something had to be done. However, the patrols yielded no results. Whenever they went out, everything seemed too quiet with no signs of the creature. But once they returned, the killings resumed, and more livestock were found dead. People grew increasingly anxious. Stories of Shankawarakan, a shape-shifting creature, began to spread. The elders of the village, who had previously dismissed such old legends, now grew quieter and more reserved. Everyone knew that something unseen, something beyond control, was lurking in the darkness. Even when I returned to university, the images and sounds from Fort Berthold haunted me. Each night, I felt the fear creeping into my mind, making it impossible to sleep. I wondered if I would ever escape it, if there was any way to return to the normal life I once had. Whenever I came back home during breaks, the changes were palpable. Fort Berthold was no longer the peaceful place it once was. Fear had taken root in everyone's lives, and no one could escape it. People who had once been my friends and neighbors now looked at me with worried, suspicious eyes. They wondered if I knew something they didn't, if I could explain what was happening. But like them, I was powerless against the strange events we were facing. Each night, I lay in my room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the creature would return. I questioned whether the stories I had heard as a child were just idle tales, or if they were warnings from the past, warnings we had ignored for too long. But no matter how many questions I asked, I found no answers, and the fear remained, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike when I least expected it. While I struggled to cope with my own fear, my younger brother Josh became increasingly obsessed with what he had seen. He started researching old stories, legends about monsters and strange creatures. Josh was no longer the innocent boy I once knew. He changed, becoming quieter and spending most of his time in his room, drawing pictures that only he could understand. First, I thought it was just Josh's way of dealing with the fear. But then, his drawings became more and more bizarre. He sketched creatures he called Shankawarakan, monsters with shifting shapes, black eyes like the night, and sharp teeth. Every day, he drew a new picture, each more horrifying than the last. Josh's drawings began to truly worry me. I tried talking to him, asking him about what he was drawing, but Josh would either give short answers or not respond at all. It was as if he was living in his own world, a world filled with darkness and grotesque images. Things came to a head one cold winter day. I walked into Josh's room and found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by the most terrifying drawings I had ever seen. My heart stopped when I saw those images. I couldn't hold back any longer. I snatched the sketchbook from Josh's hands and told him that none of this was real, that the creature would never come back. Josh looked up at me, eyes full of defiance. "How do you know? You saw it too, and you ran away like a coward." I felt something ignite inside me. I hadn't meant to push him, but I did. Josh stumbled, falling into a bucket and then collapsing onto the floor. I stood there, breathing heavily, feeling both angry and sick to my stomach. I ran to get help. "You idiot. What are you gonna do? Draw yourself to death?" The words spilled out, more venomous than I intended. Josh muttered under his breath, rubbing his arm as he clambered back to his feet, still clutching the sketchbook. "You don't know anything. Maybe I'm the only one who understands." He stormed out of the room, leaving me with a sinking feeling. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. A year later, when spring arrived with its cold rains, the creature came back. This time, Mrs. Gray Cloud, our elderly neighbor, was the next victim. Her screams echoed across the fields, sending my father and cousins rushing out of the house with guns in hand. I didn't hesitate either, grabbing my old hunting rifle and following them. What we found at Mrs. Gray Cloud's small house was a horrifying sight. The wooden door hung by a single hinge, and the floor was completely destroyed. The entire house was enveloped in an eerie silence. Cold moonlight shining through the shattered windows, casting ghostly shadows across the debris-strewn floor. Mrs. Gray Cloud was nowhere to be found. We searched everywhere, but all we found were the creature's footprints, massive and blood-stained. And then, from outside, came the most horrifying sound I had ever heard. A howl, piercing and mocking, echoing through the dark night, ending with a wet, tearing sound that made my stomach churn. I knew we were too late. Mrs. Gray Cloud was gone, and there was no reason to continue chasing the creature tonight. Time following Mrs. Gray Cloud's death was filled with days of unease and fear. Everyone in the village avoided going outside after dark, and armed patrols were more frequent. But the creature continued to evade capture. Hiding in the shadows of the reservation, as if it knew how to dodge every attempt to hunt it down. My family grew more distant than ever. We hardly spoke to each other anymore, each of us trapped in our own fears. My father even considered selling off all the livestock and moving away, but deep down, I knew he was hesitating, unwilling to leave this place. Fort Berthold had been our home for generations, and leaving wasn't something to take lightly. My mother, however, was different. She hadn't said much since Mrs. Greycloud's passing, her eyes constantly filled with sorrow and a vacant look. She no longer dismissed the stories of monsters like she used to, but I knew her silence held more than she let on. Sometimes I would catch her sitting quietly by the window, gazing out across the fields as if waiting for something to return, though I didn't know what it was. Josh, my younger brother, withdrew even deeper into his own world. He often spent his time in the barn, drawing pictures of the creature with sharp eyes and long, jagged claws, as if he understood it better than anyone else. One cold April evening, just after the sun had set behind the mountains, I decided to go out and check on the livestock once again. Although it was getting dark, I couldn't sit inside with this constant feeling of unease. I grabbed my hunting rifle and stepped outside, crossing the field toward the woods where the cattle usually gathered. The wind blew fiercely, carrying a bone-chilling cold, and each step I took on the dry grass made an unsettling rustling sound. I had faced that creature once before, and since that night, I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it forever. Despite the fear still gnawing at me, curiosity and a sense of duty drove me forward. The cattle stood there, silent and alert, as if they sensed something unusual lurking in the shadows. The faint light of the moon shone down on them, making them look like ghostly figures in the darkness. I stopped when I heard a strange noise coming from behind the bushes. It wasn't the wind, nor the sound of breaking branches. It was a growl, a low, menacing sound, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the noise, and immediately those glowing amber eyes appeared again in the darkness. It had returned. The creature stood among the bushes, larger and more menacing than ever before. I could feel its gaze, not just the hungry eyes of a beast, but something far more cunning and calculating. It knew I was there, waiting, as if deciding whether I was worth becoming its prey. I dared not move, feeling as if every nerve in my body was pulled tight. The creature remained still, neither advancing nor retreating. The silence between us stretched on, creating a suffocating tension, as if time itself had slowed down. And then, suddenly, it let out a deafening roar, a deep, guttural sound that echoed across the field. Its roar was unlike any animal I had ever heard, a disturbing mix of anger and twisted delight. I felt a chill run through me from head to toe. With no other choice, I raised my gun, aiming straight at the creature in front of me. But before I could pull the trigger, it lunged forward, fast as lightning. I didn't have time to react. Its strength was overwhelming, knocking me backward. My gun slipped from my grasp, rolling far out of reach. The creature stood right in front of me, crouched down, growling menacingly. In that moment, I thought it was the end for me. But instead of tearing me apart, the creature abruptly stopped, its glowing eyes staring at me as if weighing some unseen decision. Then, just like before, it turned and walked away, vanishing into the darkness once again. Leaving me lying there with my heart racing and my mind spinning. I lay there, feeling as though every bit of strength had left my body. I had survived, but I didn't know why. Why hadn't it attacked me? Why had it walked away? When I returned home, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Everyone was still too devastated by Mrs. Greycloud's death, and I didn't want to add to their worry. But I knew the creature hadn't left the reservation. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. A week later, the village's fear reached its peak. Another woman had gone missing in the woods, and this time there were no signs of an attack by the creature. No one found her body, but everyone knew what had happened. The monster had returned, and it had no intention of stopping. Josh became more obsessed than ever. He was convinced that the creature was some ancient demon, and that he alone understood it. His drawings grew more terrifying by the day, filled with images of massive, bloody, and grotesque monsters. My mother tried to talk him out of it, but Josh wouldn't listen. Then, one night, Josh disappeared. The next morning, my mother discovered that Josh's room was empty. The window was wide open, and his sketchbooks, filled with horrifying images, were scattered across the desk. We searched everywhere, combing through the woods, but no one found him. Josh had vanished, just like the woman before him. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I swear I hear that howl in the wind. I tell myself it's the sound of coyotes or dogs, but deep down, I know what it is. And the worst part is, after all this time, I think maybe Josh knew too. He stared directly into the darkness, saw its true form, and called its name. I still don't know if that made him brave or foolish. Maybe we both were. Some people believe that the creature took him, making him another victim. Others say he went looking for it, to understand or to seek revenge. The only thing I know for certain is that he's gone, and the shadow that fell over this place since that autumn has never truly lifted. The name Josh whispered in his final days, a demon or spirit from forgotten legends, now haunts my mind as well. Akna, bringer of hunger and destruction. I hope I'm wrong. I hope he found peace. Either way, this story isn't over. My name is Harlan Eagletooth, and I worked as a ranger in Gila National Forest in 1978. That job was my life. There was something about the forest that brought peace to my soul. Fresh air, the sound of the wind rustling through the pines, and the sense of protecting something so precious, it was beyond compare. I grew up on the reservation, so being out in the wilderness felt like returning to my true home. That August, the heat was unbearable, hotter than any summer I had ever experienced. On a morning in early August, I was patrolling a remote area near the Gila River Junction. The sky was cloudless, and the harsh sunlight beat down on the jagged rocks, making the landscape look more arid and unforgiving than ever. A slight breeze passed through, not enough to relieve the oppressive heat, but that didn't bother me. I loved the quiet of the forest, how every step I took seemed to sync with the heartbeat of the nature surrounding me. However, that peace was soon shattered. The radio strapped to my side crackled incessantly. The tense, hurried voice of a colleague came through the speaker. "We just got a report of a missing person. Emily Peterson, a young woman, has disappeared. Her campsite was found abandoned. Harlan, you're the closest. Can you get to the scene?" My heart raced, and my blood seemed to freeze. Emily Peterson, a name I hadn't heard before, but an image of the girl flashed in my mind instantly. She was probably the type who did yoga every morning, dressed in trendy outdoor gear, and believed she could conquer nature with a few basic skills. But the wilderness doesn't surrender so easily. If Emily had gone out alone and something had happened, she wouldn't stand a chance. A vague sense of dread crept over me. I rushed downstream toward the location where the rescue team said they had found Emily's campsite. The path became more treacherous, the terrain rugged with thick bushes and jagged rocks jutting out along the riverbank. Sweat poured down my face, my uniform clinging to my skin. The radio crackled again, the rescue team's voice breaking up due to weak reception. "We're on our way, but it'll take a few more hours. Harlan, you'll have to hold on." Cold sweat ran down my spine. It felt like I was racing against time, and the further I went, the more isolated I felt in the vast, unforgiving forest. Tripped, stumbling over a hidden tree root beneath the layer of decaying leaves. My binoculars slammed into a nearby rock, shattering to pieces. Damn it. I knelt to assess the damage, feeling a surge of anxiety rise in my chest. This was no time for equipment failure. But as I looked up, what I saw instantly made my heart pound. A bright purple backpack stood out against the monochromatic landscape. It was wedged under a cluster of rocks, torn as if it had been snagged on something sharp. My heart sank. It had to be Emily's backpack. I rushed over, my hands trembling as I knelt to examine it. The fabric was shredded, with strange black smears across it, as if something had dragged it over the rocks. In the harsh sunlight, I couldn't tell if it was mud, blood, or something worse. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me. A rustling noise, like something moving through the brush. I spun around, my hand instinctively reaching for the gun at my side, eyes scanning every shadow. Silence, complete silence. Maybe it was just a deer, or perhaps a startled fawn reacting to my movements. I tried to calm myself, but the unease lingered. I called out, my voice echoing through the stillness. "Emily Peterson, Ranger Harlan Eagletooth here." No response. only the deathly quiet of the forest. Slowly, I turned back to the backpack, trying to steady my nerves. I couldn't just ignore this clue. Pulled out my pocket knife and cut open the straps of the bag. I knew I shouldn't tamper with evidence, but I needed to see if there was a first aid kit inside. Maybe Emily was injured and waiting for help somewhere nearby. There was nothing inside. No water, no first aid kit, not even any personal belongings. Just a dark, sticky residue and a sickly sweet smell, like rotting fruit. Cold chill ran through me. This wasn't normal. The sound came again, this time closer, clearer. It definitely wasn't a deer. I could feel the danger closing in around me. My hand gripped the gun tightly, my eyes locked on the brush ahead. The trees began to part, and as I saw something slither out of the shadows, a wave of absolute terror swept over me. The creature was too large to be a bear. Its skin was dark and wrinkled, resembling the bark of an ancient tree, but emitting a faint, sickly glow. Its head, oh God, its head was like that of a wolf, but not like any wolf I had ever seen. Its teeth were long and curved, like enormous tusks stained a deep crimson. Its eyes were two hollow, black voids. No whites, only terrifying darkness staring straight into me. It charged at me, swift as the wind. I fired, not aiming precisely, just reacting in self-defense. The gunshot echoed through the mountains, shattering the stillness that had been there moments before. The creature let out a horrifying scream, a sound so dreadful it shook me to my core, as if I were trapped in a nightmare. Recoiled, but those black, soulless eyes never left me. I fired again, this time hitting the target. A sickening thud followed, and the creature roared with rage, though there was no sign of pain. It charged again, faster than before. My gun clicked empty, out of bullet. Fear completely overtook me, and I fumbled with the spare magazine, but my trembling hands failed me. The creature was closing in, its foul stench overwhelming, making my head spin. In a moment of desperation, I lunged forward, smashing the gun into its snout. A loud crack echoed, and the creature staggered. Blood and a disgusting fluid sprayed across my face. I didn't think, I just knew this was my only chance to escape. As the creature reeled, I turned and ran with every bit of strength I had left. My feet slipped on the rocky ground, but I didn't stop, didn't dare look back. The creature's heavy breathing echoed behind me, mingling with the sound of snapping branches and enraged snarls. My heart pounded wildly, my body locked in panic, but I couldn't stop running. I had no idea how long I ran, only that my legs ached as if they were about to give out. Everything around me began to blur. All I could hear was my own labored breath and the creature chasing after me. Sharp rocks jutted up beneath my feet, tearing at my worn boots, but I didn't care. My mind focused on one thing, getting away from this place. Suddenly, my foot slipped hard on a patch of loose earth. I tumbled down, crashing into a fallen tree, finally coming to a stop against a large boulder. I lay there, trying to catch my breath, ears straining for any sound. Creature's growl echoed again, closer this time. I slowly reached for the spare magazine at my belt. My thoughts were a blur, but I knew if I didn't reload now, it would be the end of me. With trembling hands, I reloaded, the gun slick in my grip as if it were about to slip from my fingers. But then, the growling stopped. I heard nothing but the wind whistling through the trees, eerie silence spreading across the forest. The creature had vanished, or at least I couldn't sense it anymore. I didn't dare move. My entire body was frozen, cold sweat soaking my back. Time seemed to stand still, leaving me alone with the darkness of the forest. There was no way it would leave so easily. I strained to listen for any hint of movement, but there was nothing except the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. And then suddenly I heard breathing, not my own, but its breathing. Harsh, labored, it came from just behind the boulder. My heart sank. Was still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. Slowly, I turned my head to look behind me, shining my flashlight into the space ahead. The dark eyes gleamed from the shadows, only a few meters away. The creature still stood there, motionless, its gaze never leaving me. I could see it more clearly now, the rough, wrinkled skin like tree bark, faintly glowing. Its long, curved tusk-like teeth were dripping with fresh blood. It didn't charge like before, but its eyes said it all. It was toying with me, like a cat playing with a mouse. Each time I moved, it crept a little closer, solid legs crushing the dry grass beneath, making soft but haunting sounds. Couldn't wait any longer. I jumped up, drew my gun, and fired. The shot pierced the air, echoing through the mountains. The creature recoiled but didn't flee as it had before. It let out a roar, full of fury and anger. I fired another shot, this time hitting its shoulder, and blood sprayed everywhere. But strangely, it didn't seem to be in pain. Instead, it grew even more frenzied, charging at me with unimaginable speed. I backed away, desperately trying to find an escape. But the forest was too thick, with no clear path out. I stumbled, my feet caught in vines, and when I looked up, the creature was right in front of me. I had no other choice. I threw the gun aside and lunged at the creature with all the strength I had left. My fist struck its head, but the creature didn't budge. It turned and bit hard into my shoulder. I screamed in agony, feeling as if my shoulder was being ripped apart. In a panic, I grabbed a nearby rock and smashed it into the creature's head. It staggered, its black eyes glaring at me with rage. I kept hitting it, over and over, until it finally let go of me and backed away. My blood and its blood mingled, dripping onto the ground. The creature let out one final growl before staggering off into the darkness. My fingers, slick with blood, fumbled over the numbers. Phone rang once, twice, and then a woman's voice, clear and sharp, came through the line. 911, what's your emergency? I gasped out the words, my voice hoarse. This is Ranger Eagle Tooth. I need help in Gila National Forest. And then the world spun. I felt a heavy blow to the back of my head. Phone slipped from my hand. As my vision blurred, I saw the creature emerge from the shadows again. Its dark eyes glistened in the twilight. They say the search team found me the next morning, unconscious and severely injured. Emily was never found. The official story is that I was attacked by a rabid animal, possibly a bear or a mountain lion, but I know what I saw out there. They think I suffered from trauma, that I hallucinated, or maybe they've decided the truth is too terrifying to accept. I'll return to work in a few months, doing desk duty until I pass the physical exams. Of course, no one believed my story, but sometimes at night, when I close my eyes, I can still smell that rotting stench, hear the rustling in the darkness, and see those eerie black eyes. I know it's still out there, lurking in those ancient forests. And that creature, whatever it is, maybe the old stories on the reservation were right all along. Maybe there are things in this world older, darker, and hungrier than we can truly understand. Shapeshifter. In 1992, I was working at a friend's cattle ranch in Montana, earning some money while figuring out my next steps in life. My name is Akasita, from the Oglala Lakota tribe. People often said I had a special way with animals, that they responded to the calmness I projected. In truth, I just preferred being outdoors, in wide open spaces, rather than cooped up in some office. Montana was breathtaking in its harsh way. Endless skies, vast grasslands, and the rugged peaks of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. But even in that vastness, there were places that held their own mysteries. Places like the wilderness, where we found the first carcass. It was a bull, torn apart with an unimaginable level of brutality. No natural predator in Montana could cause such destruction. The vultures had already started circling overhead, the stench of death thick in the stifling summer air. We reported it over the radio to the ranch, everyone's faces grim. Think it was a bear? Bill, my friend, asked as we checked the rest of the cattle. Bill was a good guy, though still pretty green when it came to surviving out in the wild. I don't think so, replied. Bears don't leave tracks like this. I pointed down at the ground near the carcass. Deep in the mud were massive footprints, each toe marked with a sharp claw. We stared at the tracks, a cold chill cutting through the afternoon heat. You ever hear those stories about Bigfoot? Bill asked, his voice laced with unease. The idea of a giant ape-like creature hiding in the deep woods always seemed like campfire jokes. But looking at those footprints, I started to doubt. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Let's not jump to conclusions. Could be some prankster messing around. We reported back to Pete, the ranch owner, a no-nonsense man with a wiry frame and a permanent scowl. He grumbled over the radio, telling us to head back to the main house. By the time we returned, the sun was nearly set, and an air of unease hung over the ranch. Few of Pete's cowhands had gathered outside, their faces serious and rifles in hand. Rosie's gone missing, one of the men said, his voice a mix of anger and fear. Rosie was an old ranch dog, practically a mascot around here, often dozing off at my feet while I mended fences. Missing? You think wolves got her? I asked, trying to hide the growing knot of worry in my gut. Not with tracks like those, another cowboy replied gravely. We found some big footprints leading toward the woods. Pete stepped out of the house, a hunting rifle in his hands, his gaze sweeping over us, assessing each man. We're going out there. We need to find what's killing the cattle and put an end to it. A tense silence fell over the group. These weren't city workers. They were men who had spent their lives on the edge of the wilderness, hardened like steel. But even the toughest among them had a trace of fear in their eyes now. The sun was setting as we began our trek, long shadows stretching out as we moved toward the edge of the forest. There were 10 of us in the group, all armed and on high alert. Pete led the way, his eyes scanning the brush like a hawk. The forest was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of crickets chirping and leaves rustling were completely absent, as if the entire woods were holding its breath. It didn't take long before we found the dog, or what was left of it. It lay among a pile of broken branches, its body torn apart, almost unrecognizable. A wave of sadness and fury washed over me. That sweet, gentle animal had been turned into this, and whatever had done it wasn't any natural predator. It was a monster. We've got to stop this, I muttered. Pete nodded, his face grim. We will. We pressed deeper into the forest, following the massive footprint. As the twilight deepened, the trees closed in, making it harder to see. Then suddenly, from up ahead, we heard a low, guttural growl, as if it was coming from the very earth beneath us. The group froze, guns raised, muscles tense. There, someone whispered, and we all turned our heads. Emerging from the shadows was a massive figure, towering over 2 meters tall. Its body was covered in thick, black fur, and its eyes glowed with a strange golden light. But the most terrifying feature was the long, curved claws, shining like polished tusks. For a moment, we all stood frozen, unable to believe what we were seeing. Bigfoot. But this wasn't the gentle giant from Campfire Tale. This creature radiated a primal, malevolent threat. Pete, ever the man of action, was the first to break free from the paralyzing fear. He raised his rifle and fired. Beecher roared in surprise, not pain. The shot only made it angrier. Everything descended into chaos. The monster charged with unimaginable speed, smashing through our line. Gunshots rang out wildly amidst the confusion, echoing through the forest. I fired my rifle, watching dust kick up as the bullet hit its thick hide, but it only staggered forward. Then I was flung aside like a cheap rag doll, slamming hard into a tree, my gun flying out of my hand. My vision blurred, and through that haze I saw Bill being dragged into the thick brush, his scream cut short by a sickening, choking sound. Something in me snapped. Primal rage surged forward, overpowering the fear. I forced myself to stand, ignoring the dizziness, and pulled the hunting knife from my belt. Creature loomed over Pete, who was bleeding on the ground. I roared, charging at it, the hunting knife my only weapon, screaming a battle cry that had no meaning. It swung its claws at me, but years of working on the ranch had sharpened my reflex. I ducked and rolled to the side, claws tearing through my shirt but missing my skin. In a tense moment, the creature seemed surprised, golden eyes widening slightly, perhaps not used to its prey fighting back. That brief hesitation was all I needed. I sprang up and plunged the knife deep into its side. Creature let out an ear-splitting roar that shook the entire forest. Dark black blood sprayed out, splattering the fallen leaves beneath us. A strange stench filled the air, a mix of burnt smoke and decaying flesh. Staggered back, its eyes filled with rage and pain. For a moment, I could see the shock in its golden eyes, as if it had never encountered prey that could fight back like that. But that fury only lasted for a fleeting second. It roared again, but this time it wasn't the roar of rage. It was fear. Without waiting a moment longer, creature turned and bolted into the forest, crashing through the underbrush with a speed and power as ferocious as when it had first appeared, leaving a trail of broken branches and crushed bushes in its wake. I stood there, panting, unable to believe what had just happened. Panic slowly subsided, replaced by the ache and exhaustion as the adrenaline drained from my body. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my heart in my chest and my own ragged breath. I looked down at the hunting knife still coated with the creature's dark blood, blade trembling slightly in my hand. I was alive. Somehow, I had survived. Immediately, I thought of Pete. Staggering over to him, my knees nearly buckling from fatigue and pain, I saw him lying there, his face pale, his shirt soaked in blood. But he was still breathing, faint but steady enough for me to feel the life in him. The rest of the group slowly emerged from their hiding spots, their faces a mixture of horror and relief. They had seen that monstrous creature too, and they knew surviving this encounter was nothing short of a miracle. We quickly administered first aid to Pete and the others, then staggered back to the ranch, our exhausted legs dragging through the forest now cloaked in darkness. The wounds had been temporarily bandaged, but what weighed heaviest on our hearts was Bill's death. He had been dragged into the forest, disappeared without a trace, and we knew there was no hope of finding him alive. That night, we sat around a small campfire, the sparks swirling into the air like faint, ghostly figures. No one spoke much. Everyone was haunted by what they had witnessed. Finally, when the subject of the creature was brought up, there wasn't a shred of doubt among us about what we had faced. "It was Sasquatch," Pete said in a raspy voice, weakened by his injury. He had always dismissed such myths, but tonight his eyes told a different story. He believed now. "I always thought it was nonsense," he continued, his voice fading into the silent night. "But not anymore." We sat there in silence, each of us wrestling with the horrifying truth of what we had just witnessed. We hadn't only faced a legendary creature, but also the fact that, in the ancient forests of Montana, there are mysteries humanity has never truly understood. The others murmured in agreement. The legends of a giant hairy man had echoed through this land for generations, whispered stories told with a mix of awe and skepticism. Now the line between myth and reality had blurred beyond recognition. Something monstrous lurked in that forest, something that threatened all of us. The aftermath weighed heavily on the ranch. Some of the ranch hands quit, too terrified to stay after what they had seen. We buried Bill with heavy hearts, a grim reminder, the deadly power of this creature. Despite the tragedy, a strange sense of determination took hold among those of us who remained. This was our land, and we weren't going to let a monster drive us away, no matter how terrifying it was. We reinforced the fences, set up a rotating night patrol, and swore to protect both the livestock and each other. News of the attack spread like wildfire through the community. Some dismissed it as the ramblings of traumatized men. Others, those who lived near the edge of the wilderness, listened with grim faces, their eyes reflecting a shared unease. Hunters and researchers flocked to the area, eager to find evidence of Bigfoot's existence, though the creature proved maddeningly elusive. For me, life carried on, but it was forever changed. Couldn't shake the memory of Rosie or the haunting image of Bill being dragged into the forest. Nights passed in restless sleep, haunted by ghostly growls and the imagined sensation of sharp claws tearing through my flesh. One crisp autumn morning, a year after the attack, I saddled my horse and rode out to the edge of the forest. I had unfinished business, a debt to settle. I entered the woods alone, rifle in hand, my senses on high alert. This time, the feeling was different, not peaceful, but it carried the tense stillness of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. I had been tracking the creature for days, a silent hunter pursuing an elusive phantom. Finally, under the eerie glow of the full moon, I saw it. It was crouched over the fresh carcass of a deer. Grotesque silhouette stood stark against the silver moonlight. A familiar rage flared in my chest, but beneath that anger there was something else. Strange kind of fear for the creature. It was an apex predator, a being completely in tune with the wild. There was an undeniable savage beauty to it. I found myself hesitating, my finger hovering over the trigger. I had hunted my whole life. This felt different. This wasn't about keeping the ranch safe. Not anymore. This was something primal, a struggle between two creatures fighting for their place in the world. In that moment, looking into those uneasy golden eyes, I thought I understood in a way most people never would. It wasn't some supernatural demon, but an ancient force of nature, as old as stone. Simply trying to survive. We humans were not that different. In the end, I lowered my gun without a sound. I turned and walked away, leaving the creature undisturbed. I never set foot in that forest again, and sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice. Maybe it kept killing, not just cattle, but humans as well. Maybe by sparing it, I had made myself into a monster, just like it was. I won't pretend to have all the answers, but the locals, they began calling it Wahila, a name from ancient tribal legends, spirit of the wild and untamed fury. They say it still roams those forests, a shadow on the edge of understanding. As for me, well, I became a ranger somewhere far away, protecting wilderness. Yet every night, I still hear that growl in my dreams and wonder how much of the human, how much of the monster, resides in all of us. As time went on, the story of our encounter began to spread throughout the region. Rumors started about a monstrous creature wandering the woods, and slowly, those rumors became a hot topic in the local pubs and nearby towns. Some called it Sasquatch, others believed it to be another kind of beast, while some even linked it to ancient legends of mystical creatures. But no one, except for us, knew the true horror of that night. A few weeks later, a group of researchers and hunters from the city arrived, bringing with them modern equipment and weapons to hunt the truth. They laughed at us, calling our story superstitious nonsense. Even joking that they would soon catch the creature, none of us wanted to argue. We had seen what they hadn't, and their arrogance told us they would never be prepared for what we had faced. Not long after the hunting party ventured into the woods, we heard gunshots echoing from afar. The sound rumbled across the valley, and then there was silence, as if nothing had ever happened. No one among us spoke, but deep down, we all knew the hunting party would never return. From that day on, no one dared to enter the forest again. The rumors and stories continued to spread, but Pete's ranch slowly faded into obscurity. We kept working, but the fear lingered in the hearts of everyone, like a ghost that refused to leave. Pete sold the ranch after that summer and moved elsewhere. Some of us found new jobs and left Montana, carrying with us the haunting memories and sleepless nights. For me, the encounter with the creature changed everything. I was no longer the carefree man who loved freedom and the wilderness. Every time I looked at Montana's vast skies, I saw the deep shadows of the forest, and I knew that somewhere out there, the creature was still lurking, waiting for its chance to emerge again. It was the summer of 1982 when I worked in the coldest and harshest wilderness of Alaska. People called me Red Crow, a name that I felt suited me. Strong, untamed, and unafraid to face what most people would back away from. Back then, I was young and full of reckless energy, the kind of guy the pipeline crews needed. Stubborn, fearless, and not afraid of danger. We were installing segments of oil pipelines stretching across miles of untouched wilderness. The area was so remote, isolated from civilization. There was no one around except us and the occasional giant bear or a herd of reindeer quietly passing by. A majestic yet perilous landscape. Our only neighbor was nature, wild, unpredictable, and at times brutal. That day, a hot August day, a few of us were assigned to head toward Blacktail Creek. The creek snaked through a narrow canyon with dense trees and thick brush that seemed to form an impenetrable wall. Our job was to clear the trees, making way for the pipeline. There was nothing but silence, the sound of axes hitting dry trees, and our heavy breathing echoing in the desolate space. But then, the silence was broken. I heard a sound, deep in the woods, something moving. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a stray reindeer. Then I realized something was off. The sound moved too fast, too erratically, unlike any animal I'd ever heard. Soon, the others heard it too. We all froze, our faces pale. A low, guttural growl echoed from deep within the forest. A sound that sent a chill down my spine. I felt my muscles tense, as if survival instinct had gripped my body before my mind could process the situation. No one spoke, but we all knew that something unnatural was lurking nearby. And then it burst from the shadows, a massive figure. For the first time, we laid eyes on the creature. It looked like a wolf, but not a regular wolf. The beast was enormous, its back hunched and its eyes, those eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. The gaze of a predator that didn't belong to this world. Panic swept over us as we screamed and scattered, trying to escape the monster. But the creature was too fast. In a flash, it had Jake, a man as big as a bear, known for his strength. Jake's scream, filled with pure terror, lasted only a second before it was drowned out by the sound of growling and the sickening crack of bones breaking. That sound echoed through the canyon, etching itself into my memory. At that moment, I knew that what we were facing wasn't a natural creature. My heart raced, and my mind began to flash through the stories from back home. Tales of Shankawarkan, the monstrous wolf spirit, surged into my thoughts. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, desperately trying to make it back to the worksite. Nothing filled my head except primal fear. The pounding of my footsteps on the dry grass and the sound of my own heavy breathing. When I got back to camp, I was gasping for breath, shouting for help. Foreman Harlan, a gruff old man known for his cold demeanor and practical nature, didn't believe me at first. "Must have been wolves that got him," he muttered, staring towards the canyon, squinting as if trying to find a reasonable explanation. But I knew what I had seen. That thing wasn't a wolf. It was something far more terrifying. Eventually, a small group of us, armed with rifles, went back to the site to search for Jake. All we found were bones. Jake's skeleton had been picked nearly clean, just a few scattered fragments and his torn clothes hanging from a branch. We all exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't a normal animal attack. Jake's death didn't resemble anything we'd ever heard of. There was something cruel, something darker in the way his body had been torn apart. After that, no one dared go out alone. Even for late-night trips to relieve ourselves, we always carried guns. But no matter how prepared we were, the feeling of being hunted never left. For me, the image of those glowing yellow eyes in the darkness haunted my mind. Those weren't the eyes of a normal predator. They burned with unnatural hatred and malice, as if the creature existed solely to cause fear and destruction. 2 weeks later, one evening after sunset, Harlan pulled me aside. His voice was low, serious, unlike the usual gruffness he displayed. "Son," he said quietly, "I believe you. I've seen things out here that don't follow the laws of nature." He showed me an old leather pouch he wore around his neck. Inside was an eagle claw. "This is for protection," he said. "It might help against the things we don't fully understand." In the days that followed, sightings of the creature became more frequent. It always lurked at the edges of the camp, never fully revealing itself, just fleeting shadows and eerie howls echoing through the night. Then, one by one, people began to disappear. They would leave camp at night and never return. All we ever found were their abandoned backpacks on the trail. Their bodies never recovered. One night, the creature grew bold enough to attack the camp directly. I was on guard duty, my eyes scanning the tree line, and then the moonlight caught those yellow eyes, watching us from the shadows. Before I could warn anyone, a terrifying roar erupted, and the beast charged out of the forest. Blur of fur and claws. Chaos broke out everywhere. I fired my rifle, but the bullets only seemed to make it angrier. The creature tore through the camp, growling and ripping everything apart. It moved as fast as a shadow, flinging tents and men aside like leaves in a storm. Harlan stood firm, his rifle booming in the night, but the beast charged at him, unstoppable. I screamed, a cry of pure desperation, and for a brief moment, Beecher turned and looked at me. Glowing yellow eyes locked onto mine, and a strange chill ran through my body. There was intelligence in those eyes, calculating malice. Then it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving our camp in ruins and Harlan, nothing left to bury. The next morning, the camp looked like a battlefield. Tents were torn apart, belongings scattered everywhere, and despair hung heavy over everyone. 6 men were injured, one of them gravely. As for Harlan, the gruff old foreman who had been the pillar of strength for the crew, there was nothing left to bury but a few scraps of torn clothing and a streak of dried blood on the ground. After that attack, camp seemed to fall apart. The morale of the men plummeted, and many started packing their things, ready to abandon the camp rather than face the creature again. Few were braver, perhaps more desperate enough to stay. Fear had crept into every breath, every step. We were no longer the strong, brave men who first set foot in Alaska. Now, we were merely prey, waiting for our turn. I couldn't accept that. Alongside the fear, something else burned inside me. A wild and reckless anger. I was tired of running, tired of watching my brothers torn apart, hunted like helpless animals. The elders back home used to say that to fight something like Shankawarakan, it wasn't just about strength. You had to understand what it was. And that got me thinking. That night, when the moon was just a sliver behind thick clouds, I sat quietly by the dying campfire, sifting through the old albums my grandmother had once brought to Alaska. The photos were faded and worn with time, but among those yellowed pages I found what I had been looking for. The legend of the Adlet. Bloodthirsty creature born from the unholy union between a man and a she-wolf. The Adlet was no natural beast. It was a nightmare. The elders said there was only one way to kill it. You had to find its heart and drive a pure silver stake through it. I wasn't one to believe in superstitions, but after what I had witnessed, I was willing to try anything to end this nightmare. The next morning, the camp was in ruins again. Tents ripped apart, belongings scattered, and despair everywhere. Half a dozen men were injured, one gravely. Harlan, the gruff foreman who had once been our rock, was gone, with nothing left to bury but torn clothes and a smear of dried blood. After that attack, the camp seemed to crumble. Morale was in shambles, and many began packing, ready to abandon the camp rather than face the creature again. Few, perhaps braver or more desperate, stayed, but fear lingered in every breath and step. We were no longer the strong, courageous men who had first arrived in Alaska. Now we were merely prey, waiting for our turn. I couldn't accept that. Inside me, along with the fear, something else was burning. A reckless and furious anger. I was tired of running, tired of watching my brothers being torn apart, hunted like helpless animals. The elders back home used to say that to fight something like Shankawarakan, you needed more than just strength. You had to understand what it was. And that got me thinking. That night, as the moon was just a sliver behind thick clouds, I quietly sat by the dying campfire, going through old albums my grandmother had once brought to Alaska. Photos were faded, worn by time, but among those yellowed pages, I found what I had been looking for. The legend of the Adlet, a bloodthirsty creature born from the unholy union of a man and a she-wolf. The Adlet wasn't a natural being. It was a nightmare. The village elders had said there was only one way to kill it, find its heart and drive a pure silver stake through it. I wasn't one to believe in superstitions, but after everything I'd seen, I was willing to try anything to end this nightmare. The next morning, I gathered the remaining men in the camp, the brave ones and the desperate ones, those with no way out. I told them my plan, crazy plan, maybe even suicidal. We didn't have pure silver, but I'd seen a silver cigarette case in one of the backpacks left behind after one of the disappearances. If we could melt that case down, we could make a silver stake. The plan was simple and foolish. We would set a crude trap, and I would be the bait. Under the concerned eyes of the others, we melted down the silver case, fashioning a sharp stake from the molten metal. Everything happened in heavy silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the labored breathing of the men. Everyone knew this plan might not work, but it was our only chance. That night, I stood near the edge of the camp, armed only with the silver stake and a gnawing fear deep inside. The night sky was pitch black. No stars, no moon, just thick darkness swirling around me. I held my breath, listening to every sound, waiting for what was to come. Time passed slowly, and I began to wonder if the creature had disappeared. But then, a low growl rumbled through the stillness. The creature slowly emerged from the shadows, a massive figure with burning yellow eyes. It moved deliberately, as if it knew I was waiting. The stench of decay filled the air, the smell of blood and rot. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and nausea churned in my stomach. As it drew close enough, I sprang from my hiding spot, shouting to catch its attention. The creature roared, charging at me with terrifying speed. I dodged the first attack, but I couldn't avoid the second. I slipped and fell, panic starting to creep into my mind. Its claws raked across my arm, leaving deep gashes. But I didn't stop. I rolled to the side, trying to create distance and find an opening to drive the silver stake into it. The creature circled around me, its black, bottomless eyes locked onto mine. It was toying with me, like a cat playing with its prey. My breath became rapid, my heart pounding as if it would burst. I knew there was only one chance left. And then it charged at me again. I knew I couldn't dodge in time. In a desperate move, I raised the silver stake high, aiming straight for where its heart would be. A roar of pain ripped through the night, tearing apart the stillness. I opened my eyes to see the silver stake buried deep in its chest. White smoke rose from the wound, burning the creature's wrinkled skin. It writhed, letting out one last agonizing scream, then collapsed to the ground, motionless. The others from the camp, having heard the commotion, rushed over. We stood there, staring at the giant fallen beast. Even in death, it exuded a brutal menace. Its once burning yellow eyes slowly faded, leaving behind a massive, grotesque corpse. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. This was no natural beast. It was an embodiment of ancient darkness and hatred. The next morning, we decided to dig a deep pit and bury the creature along with the silver stake. We burned the camp, destroying everything we could, as if trying to incinerate the nightmare we had just lived through. Afterward, we left that forest carrying not just physical wounds but deep emotional scars as well. For some, the wounds were just scars on their skin. But for me and many others, we carried something much deeper. Even after returning to a normal, warm, and safe life, sometimes a cold shiver would run down my spine. The shadow of that creature seemed to still linger somewhere, hiding in the darkness as if it had never truly disappeared. I knew then that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist on the edge of human understanding, and confronting them is never easy. But at the very least, we survived, and that's the only thought I could hold on to in the years that followed to find peace. That was the first time I heard the name Rougarou. I remembered it. Elise had told me what she knew, pieces of the legends passed down through her family. Rougarou, she said, was not just a monster. It was an ancient spirit, twisted and never satisfied, born from human corruption. Those who were marked by the Rougarou, bitten, infected, could shapeshift, taking on animalistic forms. Some legends said it was a curse spread like a terrible disease. Others spoke of it as a dark pact, a human soul traded for monstrous power. "Can I kill it?" I asked, my hand lightly brushing the silver-handled hunting knife at my belt. Elise shook her head. "It can't be killed. We've tried for centuries. We've tried, but you can push it back. Force it into the darkest corners of the swamp. It will always be hungry, always seeking to spread its corruption. But if you're strong enough, you can buy us precious time. That's all we can hope for." Her words weighed heavily on my heart. This wasn't a battle with a clear ending, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth fighting. Armed with the knowledge from Elise, modern weapons, and ancient traditions, I ventured into the swamp, followed the trail, listened for strange sounds, and felt the tension of unseen eyes watching me in the darkness. I moved cautiously, like an experienced hunter, knowing that a single wrong step would be my last. After days of searching, I found it. It wasn't the creature from the murky waters or a hunched figure by the roadside. This time, its form was different. Twisted, deformed version of a man with soulless black eyes. It was Bobby, or at least what was left of him, his humanity consumed by Rougarou's corruption. My heart tightened with both rage and sorrow. There was nothing left of my friend in this monster, only a grotesque shell filled with ancient evil. He didn't recognize me, only growled and charged. The battle was brutal. Bobby, possessed by Rougarou, had strength far beyond any human, unnatural speed, and a killer's instinct. I struck him several times, but my knife and rifle only slowed the beast's relentless assault. In desperation, I pulled out my great-grandfather's silver knife. It was a gamble, faint glimmer of hope. When the blade pierced the creature's flesh, it let out a piercing scream, a sound that seemed to shake the very swamp. Black blood gushed from the wound, smoke rising from its burning skin. Rougarou thrashed in agony, its movements wild and frantic. Seizing the opportunity, I lunged forward and drove the knife in deeper, all the way to the hilt. The creature howled in pain. Its form flickered and distorted as it tried to shift again. Collapsed into the muddy ground, its movements growing weaker with each passing second. And then, with one final spasm, it went still. Its black eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, I didn't see a monster anymore. I saw Bobby, looking at me with confusion in his eyes, the eyes of a dying beast. It was just a fleeting moment before the light in his eyes faded, leaving behind empty, soulless socket. After that, everything felt like a blur. I burned the creature's body, both for safety and for the sake of my friend's soul, as best as I could. Elise and the local hunters swore to keep it a secret to protect the town from panic. The disappearances would continue, perhaps forever. For now, Rougarou lay dormant somewhere in the depths of the swamp. It was all I could do. I returned to my life up north, but the nightmares never truly went away. Sometimes in the quiet moments, I swear I can still hear the rustle of leaves, the soft steps on the swampy ground, feel the tiny black eyes watching me from the shadows. Maybe Rougarou's spirit still lingers, searching for a new host, another way to spread its corruption. Or maybe it's just my fear playing tricks on me, the echoes of that battle forever ringing in my ears. The only thing I knew for sure was that my days of being an ordinary worker were over. The world was far darker than I had ever realized. And somewhere out there, in the swamps or the shadows of the cities, ancient evils still lurked. Hungry. It was 1978, and let's just say I was young then, with far fewer worries. When I became a new ranger at the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana, it felt like I had an entire wild kingdom at my feet. My name is Elon. I grew up on this reservation, but college took me down to California to study forestry and related subjects. Returning home meant relearning the rhythms of a place as ancient as time itself. Flathead isn't the picturesque mountain scenery you'd find on a postcard. Sure, we had a few towering peaks, but most of it was dense, rugged forest, like the thick winter coat of a bear, and deep lakes so mysterious that locals swore they reached some dark, old place at the bottom. The thing is, I loved every inch of it. There was a fire inside me, drive to prove myself and maybe to a few of the elders that I could make a difference here. That summer started off like any other, marking trees, fire prevention, the usual ranger duties. But by early July, a series of strange livestock killings near the Swan Valley began to stir things up. Mostly sheep, torn apart in a brutal manner, and not even foxes would go near them. It wasn't bears either, because they leave different kinds of signs. Ranchers were blaming everything. Wolves reintroduced from Canada, even Bigfoot. My supervisor handed the case to me with a skeptical grin and a sarcastic, "Good luck." See, my tribe believes in things that go beyond textbook knowledge, and he figured maybe I'd have some ancestral insight. When I got up to the Swan Valley, things got weird quickly. I spoke with Old Man Dupuis, one of the last true nature-loving folk left. He lived in a cabin that seemed to grow straight out of the forest floor itself. His beard stretched down to his stomach, and his eyes always twinkled with mischief. "Something's gotten a taste for blood," he rasped while rocking on his chair. He pointed me to the site of the kill. It was like something out of a nightmare. Sure, it was a sheep, but its neck had been snapped cleanly, and chunks of flesh had been bitten off, as if some twisted creature was gnawing at the bones. None of it made sense to me. Even a starving wolf wouldn't leave good meat behind. Bears didn't tear things apart like that. I spent the next few days tracking whatever it was. The nights were the worst. Have you ever heard an entire forest go silent as the sun goes down? Eerie, like the whole place is holding its breath. That's when I found its tracks. I know the prints of the big animals, wolves, bears, moose, but this was something different. Each footprint was as big as my dinner plate, and the claws looked like something out of a horror movie. It sent chills down my spine, but it also ignited my stubborn streak. I wasn't leaving until I figured out what it was, no matter what science said. Finally, after countless meals by a cold campfire and what felt like endless nights under the stars, caught a break. I stumbled upon the carcass of a large buck. Most of it had already been devoured by scavengers, but the body had been dragged halfway into a thick bush near an old logging road. Now, I'm not a big guy, but I grew up hauling logs with my grandfather. I knew these woods well, and I wasn't afraid of anything lurking there. Crept into the bushes, my rifle loaded and ready. That's when the stench hit me. Decay mixed with something almost sickly sweet, enough to turn my stomach. My eyes were still adjusting to the dim light filtering through the trees when I saw it, hunched over the carcass. It was the biggest, ugliest dog I had ever seen. Its back arched, its matted fur smeared with blood. But the worst part was its head. I swear its muzzle was at least half again as long as any normal wolf's, and its teeth. God, they looked like steak knives, gleaming in the dim light. The creature stood still, mid-bite, and its eyes locked onto mine. Pitch black, no whites, as if they were staring straight through me. A low growl started deep in its chest, growing into a guttural snarl that sent chills down my spine. I didn't need the old stories to know this wasn't a natural creature. I raised my gun, acting more on instinct than any real plan. Before I could pull the trigger, the thing spun around and disappeared into the underbrush at an inhuman speed. I fired wildly in its direction, gunshots echoing through the trees, but it vanished like a ghost. After that, everything happened quickly. I stumbled back to Dupuy's cabin, rambling about the creature. I must have looked crazy, but he just nodded with that same glint in his eye. "There are things that walk between worlds," he said, pouring me a cup of coffee that tasted more like tree bark than any coffee I'd ever had. I wasn't sure if he was mocking me or if he truly believed. That night, as the fire crackled outside the small cabin, Dupuy told me stories. Old tribal legends, the kind I half believed when I was a kid. He spoke of the demon wolf Numerigar from the darkest corners of the spirit world, cunning and always hungry, driven by a thirst for killing far beyond any animal instinct. I listened, my mind racing. It explained the size, the tracks, and the brutal, wasteful way it slaughtered. Dupuy didn't tell me how to fight it. He just gave me that look, kind that said I'd either figure it out or die trying. By the time dawn painted the ragged mountain peaks pink, I had a plan, as crazy as it was. I borrowed Dupuy's old pickup truck, loaded it with supplies, and headed back to where I'd seen the creature. It took some time, but I finally found a spot with a clear view of the brush where the creature had been feeding on the carcass. Then, I set up the trap. Fresh deer carcass strung up on a few branches I had prepared the night before. It wasn't exactly a traditional hunting trap, but I was betting that the creature might be dumb enough, or hungry enough. I spent the entire day sitting in my makeshift hideout. Rifle at the ready. The worst part was the waiting. Every rustling leaf, every distant bird call made my heart pound. As the sun began to set behind the trees, casting long shadows, I started to feel a growing sense of anxiety. Would the creature figure out my trap? Or was this whole plan just foolish? I was just about to give up and head back when a movement at the edge of the forest caught my attention. It was there, a massive shape, emerging from the brush and heading straight for the hanging deer. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. I aimed, my fingers squeezing the trigger in sync with my heartbeat. The gunshot echoed through the valley, scattering a flock of crows from the treetops. Creature jerked its head, turning toward me. Then it did something I hadn't expected. Didn't howl, didn't charge blindly. Instead, it tilted its head, staring at me with those black eyes, and let out a long, cold moan. The sound was more like laughter than a groan. I fired another shot just to be sure. It staggered again, but still didn't fall. Fear tightened in my chest. This thing couldn't be stopped. Creature turned and bolted toward the trees. I leapt up, chasing after it. It moved with terrifying speed, darting through the brush like a ghost. The sun was setting fast, and darkness was swallowing everything, leaving only a faint glow in the sky. We reached a steep drop, a deep ravine carved out by an ancient stream. I slowed down, looking down into the darkness below, trying to catch a sign of the creature. There was nothing, just roots, rocks, and the soft sound of trickling water. Frustration and panic wrestled inside me. Had it outsmarted me once again? That's when I heard the whimpering, faint, almost like a pitiful cry, coming from below. Cautiously, I climbed down the jagged slope, rifle still raised. When I reached the bottom of the ravine, my eyes met the creature. It was no longer the terrifying beast I had been chasing, but a pathetic, whimpering figure, half submerged in the stream. One of its hind legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken from the fall. It looked up at me, and in its black eyes there was something new. Pain, fear, and a strange vulnerability. I raised my gun, finger hovering over the trigger. Then I hesitated. Despite its monstrous form, it was now just a wounded animal, in pain and, in some strange way, pitiful. Besides, something deep inside told me this wasn't the true evil I had been hunting. I lowered my gun and took a step back. The creature, whether it was a Numerigar or just some grotesque predator, didn't move, didn't attack. Instead, it watched me with those strangely intelligent eyes as I slowly backed away and climbed up. I gave it one last look, curled up in the fading light, then hurried back to Dupuy's cabin as darkness began to fall. I found myself deep in the Louisiana swamps, not far from Baton Rouge, on a fishing trip with an old friend. That's all this was supposed to be. My name is Silas Crowfeather, my mother of Ojibwe descent. Most of my life, I worked on rigs up north, and I figured it was time for a break before my knees gave out completely. Bobby, my friend, swore this was the best place to catch catfish within 100 miles. But all I saw were muddy waters and mosquitoes big enough to carry off a small dog. It was nearly dusk, the long shadows of the swamp turning a pale gray, when Bobby got his first bite. He yelled with excitement as he fought the catch. Whatever it was, it fought hard. When Bobby finally hauled it up, it wasn't a catfish, not even close. I'd never seen anything like it. Its skin was slick and pitch black, its body long like an eel, but that's where the similarities ended. Its head was flat like a shovel, and its small, beady black eyes were spaced too far apart, giving it an unnatural, alien look. Its mouth was full of sharp, needle-like teeth, and it thrashed and bit, making a sound more like a hiss than a growl. "What the hell is that?" I asked, stepping back. Even in the dimming light, it was clear something was very wrong with the creature. Its skin was missing in patches, revealing raw, decaying flesh, and the stench clinging to it was foul, like something that had rotted in the sun too long. "Hell if I know," Bobby said, his voice tinged with unease. "Ain't never seen anything like this in all the years I've been out here." He was about to toss it back into the water when the diseased creature lunged forward, clamping its jaws onto his hand. Bobby screamed, cursing as the thing held tight. We struggled to pry it off, but it bit down hard, its tiny teeth sunk deep into his flesh. Finally, I pulled out my pocket knife and slashed its neck. The creature released him with a wet, tearing sound, leaving a deep gash in Bobby's hand. Damn thing wasn't dead, though. It slithered back toward the water's edge with surprising speed, hissing angrily as it went. Bobby yelled, clutching his bleeding hand, his face pale. I chased after the creature, knife in hand, but it was too slippery. It disappeared into the murky water, leaving us staring at the ripples where it had vanished. Bobby cursed, wrapping his bloody hand in a dirty rag, insisting we head back to the truck to get him some proper first aid. I didn't argue much. The whole situation had me on edge. It wasn't just the attack. There was something off about that creature, feeling that it shouldn't exist. Back at the truck, we patched Bobby up as best we could, while both of us kept thinking about what had just happened. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. Something was wrong in those swamps, a darkness lurking just beyond the edges of sight. On the drive back to town, we saw a lone figure hunched by the side of the road. Even though the light was fading, there was something strange about the way that person moved. Too jerky, unnatural. My heart tightened in my chest. Growing up on the reservation, I had heard enough stories from the elders all my life, and this wasn't an animal. Not at all. "Don't stop," I told Bobby, my voice tense. "Just keep driving." He gave me a questioning look, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Felt it too, the unnatural chill in the air. As we passed, the figure turned to watch the truck. The headlights caught the person's face for a brief, terrifying moment. It was an old woman, but her eyes, they were exactly like the soulless, black eyes of the creature in the swamp. Her face stretched into a twisted grin, revealing jagged, sharp teeth. Bobby slammed the gas pedal, and the truck shot forward. I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as the figure slowly faded from view, a sick feeling curling in my stomach. That wasn't an old woman we saw out there. We had just come face to face with the same creature that had attacked Bobby, only in a more grotesque human form. When we got back to Baton Rouge, we cleaned and bandaged Bobby's hand properly, but neither of us spoke a word about what we had seen. We pretended it was some kind of mutated fish, a result of swamp pollution or a chemical spill that had gone unchecked. Lies we told ourselves just to sleep at night. In the days that followed, the bite on Bobby's hand didn't heal. Instead, it festered. He started running fevers, babbling incoherently, and his demeanor changed. There was a strange look in his eyes that scared me, as if he was turning into something else. Then, one night, he disappeared from the motel. We searched everywhere, reported it to the police, but no one ever found a trace of Bobby. He was gone, swallowed by the swamps of Louisiana. I drove straight back to Minnesota and never looked back. The nightmares followed me. Images of the swamp creature, its dead eyes and gnashing teeth, hallucinations of Bobby transforming into something monstrous, his eyes turning that same cold black. Stories from the reservation flooded back to my mind. Tales of skinwalkers, creatures that could shift between human and beast. They said you could always tell by the eyes. Deep down, I knew that whatever lived in those Louisiana swamps wasn't just a mutated animal. It was something ancient, dark, and ravenous, and it was still out there. A month later, I was sitting in a local diner, absent-mindedly flipping through the newspaper, barely paying attention to the weak coffee in front of me. Then an article caught my eye. A string of disappearances in southern Louisiana, hikers lost in the swamps, locals vanishing without a trace. In the blurry photograph attached to the piece, I saw it. Same black, soulless eyes, staring back at me. Paper offered vague explanations, blaming wild animals or possibly a serial killer. But I knew better. Coffee in my stomach turned bitter. Something told me my fishing days in the South were over. And those swamps, the ones that had taken my friend, wouldn't stay confined to that place forever. That article became my call to action. I could feel it, an itch deep in my bones, as if the hunter in me had awakened after a long sleep. Whatever that thing was, it had to be stopped. I packed my truck with essentials, supplies, hunting gear, and some old silver weapons I inherited from my great-grandfather, a Navajo silversmith. If the stories from the reservation were true, if this creature had a weakness, it would be silver. This trip back to Louisiana felt different. I was no longer a fisherman on a retreat, but a hunter tracking a dangerous foe. The air seemed to thrum with a strange energy as I approached those cursed swamps. In the nearest town, I searched for people willing to talk. I posed as someone with an academic interest in local legends, a city boy fascinated by the rumors of swamp demons. Most people laughed it off and rolled their eyes, but a few, the ones with haunted eyes, whispered stories. Stories of loved ones disappearing into the cypress trees, never to return. Stories of strange tracks, creatures that shouldn't exist. They confirmed my worst fears. Whatever was stalking those swamps, it was no longer just hunting fish or stray animals. It had developed a taste for human flesh. Rumors spread quickly in small towns, and a local elder, a woman named Elise, with wise eyes and wrinkles earned through many harsh years, found me in the rundown motel room where I had set up camp. She didn't question my motives. There was a tired understanding in her gaze, an awareness of the darkness I was up against. "You want to hunt the rougarou?" she asked, her voice rough, laced with both caution and a weary resignation. "My people have a long history with that monster. The story has lasted for generations." I had done what I could for the night. At least the killings would stop for now. The aftermath of that summer was strange. The livestock deaths stopped abruptly. No more torn-apart carcasses, no more sightings of anything around Swan Valley. I told the authorities I had chased off a wolf, a deformed rogue wolf, nothing more. Of course, they didn't believe me, but I didn't care. I knew what I had seen. The old legends whispered that Numerigar was drawn to violence, to simmering hatred between humans. Perhaps the fear and anger of the ranchers had driven it away, or maybe when the killing stopped, the demon had no reason to linger. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could get in the wilderness. I continued my work as a ranger, walking the ridges and valleys of the reservation for years after. I never saw another deformed creature, nor did I come across any more torn-up bodies. But sometimes, when the full moon hung high and the deep silence blanketed the forest, I'd remember those chilling black eyes in the darkness. Dupuy never mentioned that summer again. He'd just give me a knowing smile whenever I passed his place on patrol. He died a few years later, and I still wonder what he truly believed that night, whether it was a demon or not. A part of me still wonders if that creature is out there, limping with its broken leg, a shadow lurking in other shadows. I want to believe that maybe, just maybe, there's some kind of peace for it. Because the remarkable thing about these ancient forests, the places where the world still breathes to an ancient rhythm, is that the line between the natural and the supernatural comes terrifyingly thin. Yes, there are horrors out there, but there's also a wild mercy, balance that we, as humans, will never fully understand. That's what makes a man question everything he thought he knew, especially the things he's seen in the fading light of a dying day. That's what forces a man to reevaluate everything he thought he knew, particularly the things he witnessed in the dimming glow of a setting day. Those moments when the world seems to hover between day and night, between the natural and the supernatural, they make you question everything you once felt certain about. I've continued living my life, trolling the reservation, listening to the wind whisper through the trees, always watching for what might be lurking in the shadows. Years have passed, but on the quietest nights, I still can't forget those cold black eyes. Whether that creature still exists somewhere out there, or whether it has vanished forever, becoming nothing more than a part of terrifying memories, I can't say for sure. But one thing I do know: the line between reality and what we cannot fully comprehend is sometimes dangerously thin.